want to share what they are things they've sort of taken away so far from the study of Exodus that we've been up to this summer. I'd love to hear. Or things you're still thinking about that are sort of like a bee in your bonnet. That's like a grandma phrase, but that you feel like it is kind of coming back around over the course of the summer. Any brave souls?
I feel like one thing that stands out to me is God's faithfulness to Israel, and then accordingly Israel's lack of faith in God. It seems like they're always um, like questioning God and questioning Moses and all. And I mean, that kind of plays into the passage we're looking at today for sure. But just this kind of disproportionate and undeserving faithfulness that God has for his people.
I love that, Owen. Who else?
One thing that I've been thinking about, and this is in reference to one of Fetty's Bible studies he led, just that the amount of detail God has in each of his plans, and for things that might seem like, okay, that was a bit over the top, or like I don't really get why this happened. There's actually so much thought that's put into it, and I feel like just going through this Bible study has sort of magnified just how much God thinks through everything, and yeah, just that He's all knowing.
Yeah, one of the I think it was like Nick Nowalk on like God's law, and he said something like we had to remember the past and anticipate the future in order to fully live in the present. So I thought that was a nice soundbite.
That's good.
One of the things I'll take away is talking about the wilderness. And I remember when I was younger, when I would read about the Israelites wanting to go back to Egypt, I saw it as the most ridiculous thing. I was like why? I was like, why would they do that? Like, clearly it was awful in Egypt. But then talking about how it's like, how it's similar to like the temptation to like fall back into sin, really struck me. So I feel like there have been some things that I've been delivered from in my life that I still struggle with sometimes. And so, yeah, that really resonated with me.
Yeah, me too, Felix. I think there's a lot in Exodus that if we learned it as kids or have been in the church much, I think there's a tendency to sort of make a lot of Exodus into like a parody. And you're like, oh, the dumb Israelites. Like, here they go again. Giant eye roll, right? And we'll see a bit of that in this story. I think once you actually get into the text, you begin to realize like this actually makes a lot of sense. Like there's a ton here that I think we need to give Israel a bit of like the benefit of the doubt. And we're going to get into even a little bit of that today because the narrative of the golden calf is like that, right? Like what happened that like they like just like invent this like idol and what that, and then bow down to it. And that sounds insane. And like, are they stupid? And yeah, I think there's just more going on there than we kind of are apt to have been exposed to, and if we got a bit more simplistic exposure to it. So okay, I want us to start just for a couple minutes in Exodus 24 because so our passage today is Exodus 32 to 34, and Exodus 32 through 34 lands itself in a particular location within the text. And the kind of the early, what comes before it and what comes after it, which is what Don's going to talk about after Caleb uh, uh, teaches next week, so 2 weeks from tonight, is these very intricate and long, if you're reading through Exodus, descriptions of how to build the tabernacle. And in the middle of that, and in fact, they're very similar. The second one, the one that comes after Exodus 32 through 34, is a bit shorter, but a lot of it is repetition. And so you're like, why? Like, what is the point of this? It was boring the first time. Now it's super boring the second time, right? And to understand that, like, there actually is something going on there. But what happens before that section that starts really in Exodus 25 is the narrative that if we skipped all of the tabernacle stuff, we would go 24 and then 32. Okay? So Exodus 24 is what's happening right before the events of Exodus 32. So if you have a Bible or can pull one up on your computer, I encourage you to take a look there. And we're just going to run through this quickly. Did Veronica talk about this last week? I'm guessing she did. Exodus 24. Okay, great. Michael, thank you. Strong nod. But what we get here is Moses being called up the mountain by the Lord, and he does it. Like he goes up, he goes with Aaron, Nadab, and Abihu, who are Aaron's sons, right? Aaron's Moses' brother, the high priest, the 70 elders of Israel, right? But only Moses goes all the way up. But Moses tells the people, here's what God is expecting of us. In light of my time with him, this is what he wants from us. And then we get this just cringeworthy statement at the end of Exodus 24:3. And all the people answered with one voice and said, all the words that the Lord has spoken, we will do. And you're just like, oh my gosh, please don't. Please don't. So Moses is chronicling all of this, right? So when it talks about the words of the Lord, it's both the 10 words, right? Like the 10 commandments, which we'll get in very, very much like in the, like written on the tablet, right? Which in a sense are the treaty between God and his people. And we'll talk about that. But also these like instructions for the tabernacle, and also is coming from the Lord. So Moses is up there for 40 days and he is getting like a download. But if you think about, this is an imperfect metaphor that I just thought of off the top of my head, so forgive me. If you think of a marriage license as the legal document that makes you married, okay? That is the tablets, okay? So like that holds up in court, right? Like it that is the thing. But something like your premarital counseling, or like has a lot of like wisdom, and of course God's words are much weightier than sort of a bunch of advice about what to do. But it's the actual document that sort of connotes the relationship between Yahweh and his people are written on these tablets. And there's sort of this extra kind of more detailed stuff. So we essentially get Moses going up. There's a covenant ceremony. Covenant ceremonies always involve blood. Basically, there's this sacrifice. The blood is being sprinkled. Can you even imagine? There you go. That would be so not fun to be with all the people you know and live with and getting sprinkled with the blood of dead animals. But it was universally recognized within the ancient Near East that that was how you made a covenant. That was how they made a covenant. So the people of Israel understood themselves to be in a certain kind of relationship with their God. And then we get, starting in verse 15, this is where I want us to kind of begin as we go into Exodus 32. Then Moses went up on the mountain. The cloud, of course, the cloud of God's presence covered the mountain. The glory of the Lord dwelt on Mount Sinai, and the cloud covered it 6 days. And on the seventh day, he called to Moses out of the midst of the cloud. Now the appearance of the glory of the Lord was like a devouring fire on the top of the mountain in the sight of the people of Israel. So this is a bit of a summation from after, like in verse 12, we're getting Yahweh again saying like, come up, I'll give you the tablets. And then in 18, Moses entered the cloud, went up on the mountain, and he was on the mountain 40 days and 40 nights. So Moses on Mount Sinai, 40 days, 40 nights by himself with the Lord. And cue like, Home Alone or something, right? So here's what I want us to do. I want you guys in your groups to read through just Exodus chapter 32, which I say that it's a pretty long one. And then I want you to talk about the nature of the rebellion. So we can sort of be like, oh, it was idolatry. We need to remember that this is really the first and really the quintessential moment of idolatry for the people of Israel. This really gets things started with a bang. And so we need to, it behooves us to understand exactly what's going on. And so talk about the nature of the rebellion. Like, what is it that they're rebelling against? What does that rebellion look like? And bring everything, if you've got like previous Exodus knowledge, like bring it, do as much as you can with the actual text. So like, what clues are you taking from the text? Like what seems to be emphasized? Yeah, and then we'll come back and share a little. I'm gonna give you guys like, I don't know, 17-ish minutes. Oh, that's perfect. 8:40. Actually, I might give you a few extra because we're gonna backtrack and do a icebreaker in your small groups just because Sarah has like the best one ever. So Sarah, tell the people what they have won.
Yes, I will tell you. So the icebreaker is use a drink like Fanta or a pina colada or fruit punch to describe your mood right now. So do that first thing when you get into the breakout rooms. And Teal, if possible, could you just pop the reading again in the chat so that people would have it?
Absolutely.
Thank you so much. So sorry, guys. I am recording, so I'm going to pause and leave the breakout room. Give me 2 seconds.
Oh, there we go. Well, per usual, would love to hear what you guys talked about. What'd you notice? What'd you talk about in your groups? Feel free to out your friends for saying something amazing. Yeah.
I thought Chinaza brought up an interesting point regarding when Moses comes down and he's angry with the people and he breaks the tablets, and just the concept of righteous anger and kind of what qualifies something as being righteous anger versus oftentimes, scripture tells us to be slow to anger, and more like quick to listen, and so just that fine line between when are you right to be angry versus when should you be more reserved is an interesting question.
That's good, Owen. What else?
Aaron, like, not taking any responsibility for his craftsmanship of the calf always like gets me. Like, I just threw the gold in and a calf came out. It's always crazy how that happened, how he says that. And yeah, just allowing, like, it shows that he knew it was wrong to allow the people to, I guess, persuade him or do what he wanted to do also. And then he can't confront Moses, probably because he's like super angry too, but he can't, show his true role in that moment.
Yeah, Aaron is a fascinating character in this part of the narrative. What do we make of him? Like, how responsible is he?
I'm wondering, like, why did they want him specifically to make the calf? Like, it's almost, I mean, and this like just popped in my head. Like, did they feel like they had more approval if, the man of God is having to make it for them than if they just made it themselves? I always wondered that, like, why? I don't know. I'd love to hear people's thoughts.
No, that's a great question, Sarah. We actually will talk about that because that's a really important question. Like, why Aaron? Yeah. What else?
One of the things that we discussed was how ridiculous Aaron's excuses are. And they gave you the gold, I threw it in the fire. Okay, the calf. What's he trying to prove saying that? What serious question. What is he trying to achieve? What does he think that will achieve? Is that literally the best he can come up with on the spot?
That's a great question. I think there's a lot of farce in that element of the story. We're supposed to think that Aaron is ridiculous, like that his response is ridiculous, and we do. But yeah, no, it's like, what is going on there? I think the responsibility of Aaron becomes, for me, just a really critical question, because the question of responsibility matters in this narrative. We're talking about rebellion and judgment, and responsibility gets also deeply connected to judgment. And when you have people being killed by the thousands for their role, like, what's going on there with Aaron? So I think that's a great. We'll talk a bit more about that. Although I don't, claim to have a definitive answer necessarily. What else? Anything else around Aaron, or just around kind of what you noticed about the nature of Israel's rebellion in this?
We're saying Aaron's words of like, oh, the people gave it to me, and then out came this calf, reminded us a lot of Adam saying, oh, the woman that you gave me, she gave me the fruit and I ate it. Yeah.
That's really good, Caleb. I think you're right. Nothing like adding like a strong dose of passivity to your sin.
Bernadette, oh, sorry. Oh, I was just gonna say quickly, like Bernadette and Owen were talking about kind of the episode before when Moses was speaking with God and God was threatening to bring about disaster, and then Moses almost kind of was bargaining with God in a way, like reminding God of certain things, like what the Egyptians were saying and all of these other reasons why God shouldn't bring about disaster, and then God like relented kind of. And so how that episode takes place, like why it takes place, is it because of Moses's relationship with God is just that strong that he can do that, or what kind of relationship is this?
And can I jump in and add to that? Because I wanted to just mention, we were talking about kind of like the bargaining aspect of it, and it reminded me of Genesis with Abraham bargaining with God about Sodom and Gomorrah, right? And so this time God elects not to destroy his people, and that made me think that Israel is kind of a better version of Sodom and Gomorrah and those people, but they're still not the best version. And we all know who the best version of Israel is. But it's kind of the evolution, the next step.
Yes. Oh, and 100%. And we're gonna punt a lot of that to Caleb for next week. But yes, I mean, it's a huge part of what's happening in the story is the mediation of Moses.
At the end, when they're when Moses tells the Levites to go and like kill a neighbor and brother, it reminded me of this speech, The Ballot or the Bullet by Malcolm X, where he's like, if you really, basically, like it's very radical. Like basically, like you wouldn't care if I told you to go and kill your family, if I told you to go and kill your neighbors, if like they're keeping you from a cause, you know, of gaining like freedom or equality or whatever. And he like cites something from China, but like basically it's very radical. So like I guess that reminded me of well, the Exodus chapter section reminded me of that. So I guess what they're being held back from would be being fully recognized as God's people, which was really radical. I mean, they did a radical disobedience to God, so a radical action needs to be done to fix that in a way.
No, yes. It's a wild part of the story, essentially, that you have, I mean, it's not just anybody, right? It's the Levites who respond. It's the priests, essentially, which is actually really significant. And we'll talk about why, but yeah, that part is nuts. 3,000 people sort of killed in a day, it seems.
Could I add something on that, Teal?
Yeah.
I just think that verse particularly, verse, what is it, 27, is super interesting because God doesn't previously give Moses an instruction to like appoint the Levites as kind of executioners over the people. So either Moses has the privilege to sort of speak for God, or he like levies this punishment himself and sort of sanctifies it in the aftermath. So I just think that ambiguity is a little interesting.
Yeah.
Like it, like God does not like Moses says that God says that this thing happens, but we don't have evidence of God giving a prior instruction to Moses. So that's all I'm saying.
Yeah, no, it's interesting because I mean, we get like, I mean, some instruction, some intense instruction about, you know, what disobedience brings earlier in Exodus, right? So it's not crazy in light of the way God has already revealed himself around judgment of disobedience. But you're right, Tyler. It's not clear. But I think it's actually probably related to just Moses's role, or another underscoring of Moses's role. And Michael, your question is a great one, and actually sort of leads us in a bit to, well, we'll get there. So okay, I'm going to do a little bit of teaching just to get us. Hopefully a little bit better understanding of what's going on. But man, I wish I could have been in each of your groups because it sounds like you guys were having great conversations. There's a lot here. I'm going to like scratch the tiniest surface. But I mean, one thing to be aware of, and I'm going to come down somewhat, it might not feel like this is justified in the text. And so you're going to have to do a little bit of trusting me on this one. Partly because of Hebrew grammar, partly because of sort of ancient Near Eastern stuff. But it is fairly agreed upon by scholars that what Israel thought they were doing was making a representation of Yahweh. So they were not necessarily like, you know what we'd love to do today? Invent a new God. Like, and heads up, he probably looks like a cow, right? Like that is nuts. There's a couple things to note. It was actually pretty common around in the nations around Israel to use a cow or a calf as a representation of a deity. So this would have been like a fairly common like use, and the thought was that like essentially the god that, again, stress on the representation, that the god would actually like sit on or stand on the image. So it was a sort of a throne of sorts, or like a way of entering the camp. And so when Israel does this and they say, they kind of come to Aaron, one of the things that's clear in the Hebrew is that they actually sort of bully Aaron. So they sort of like, they like come in mob form and are like, you're going to do this for us. I think that is the best way to make sense of why Aaron is allowed to keep his job. Otherwise, what is happening, you know? So that's, I think, important to make note of. So we get, that being said, Aaron is still culpable, which I think is very clear in the narrative and in his little conversation with Moses. The reason why, so the Exodus 32 to 34, which is its own kind of chunk, is this cycle of rebellion, which we just read about, mediation, which is kind of the end of 32, or chunks of 32, a lot of 33, and a bit of 34, right? Moses going before God on behalf of the people, and really standing between the people and God, which is an incredibly important role. And actually, I'm just really excited that for next week for you guys, because there's so much cool stuff there. And then there's this restoration of relationship. And so we're going to mostly concentrate on the rebellion and the restoration, and only parts of the restoration, insofar as we're not getting into the middle part. But this sense of, one thing to be aware of is that because this passage happens in between descriptions of the tabernacle, and the tabernacle is this tent. It has it's 150 feet on one side, on two sides. It's like a rectangle, 150 feet, 150 feet, 75 feet, 75 feet. So considerable size. It contains the Ark of the Covenant, which if you remember like Sunday school or whatever, is sort of the has to be carried on poles. It has cherubim. There's a mercy seat. Inside the tabernacle, this is where essentially the sacrifices are being made, that God is dwelling in the midst of his people in this very careful, very mediated, transcendent, majestic, fearsome way, right? So we get Israel saying things like, hey, Moses, you go talk to God, we're good, let us know what he says, right? There is this, both like in the camp, these instructions are given for the tabernacle, and yet there's a fearsomeness to Israel being near God and led by God and amazed by God, but also like desiring. And I think what's going on in Exodus 32, and the part we can actually maybe be a little like empathetic about for Israel, is that Israel's like, we need like a God who's a little bit closer and like a little bit more manageable, and like that feels familiar, Like we know, like Egypt had a bunch of God, and they knew what to do, and they also had feasts, and like it was a party, like they want, and there's this. I think there is a reading of Exodus 32 that is, this is part of the problem of the hiddenness of God. That not only is God scary at times and difficult to draw near to, but also Moses has been gone for 40 days, and Moses is the representative of God to the people, right? They like, there's a lot going on with Yahweh, but like at least they know Moses, right? Now Moses has been gone. So I think when we talk about idolatry, one of the ways we need to think about our own tendency towards creating things that we worship is both this desire to worship. So the interesting thing is, remember in Exodus, in the passage we just read, when Joshua and Moses are up, and Joshua says, like, do you hear that? It sounds like war. And Moses says, it's neither victory nor defeat, it's singing. Which is like a strange thing to say. You're kind of like, that's random. I think what the author is doing is saying, like, worship is happening. Like, and that worship is like actually, like they can hear it on Sinai. And so there's this sense of like this draw to worship. And in that, and yet like they're in the middle of these instructions from Yahweh about what worship is meant to look like, where it's meant to look like, where it's meant to be, who's meant to lead that, right? All of the instructions around the priests and sacrifices. In the middle of those two sections, bookended, we get Israel taking it into their own hands, right? Taking these very real challenges that I think we need to acknowledge, some of which we can relate to on a level, and also this very real drive and capacity, like the desire to worship, the desire to like give credit to something, right? To be thankful for this act of redemption, and yet they don't want to do it on God's terms. So. And on the terms, frankly, that they have also agreed to. So, so we get this image of, it's really surrounding this sense of this covenant. So as I mentioned, the 10 words, the 10 commandments are like a treaty document, or a good way to think about it is like a contract, except the contract is kind of also embedded with story. But this contract, and that when Moses breaks the tablets, it's this symbol, like that moment is like the mic drop. It is the like tragic, those like what are they, like bounty commercials or whatever, where it's like, I don't know, mom and dad are like in the kitchen or whatever, and like the kid like reaches over, and then like you watch the like glass like start to like fall in slow mo, and then like mom or dad like grabs the paper towels, and like it's like, oh, it's okay, right? But like it's that without the cleanup, right? It is this moment of just like at times slowing down, and Moses just being like, the symbol of God has made his home with you, and these are the conditions under which the presence of the creator God of the universe is going to make his home with you. Like, it's broken. And this question of like, what in the world do we do, right? Because in a sense, Israel, right, they're having this worship service, but I mean, there's also a connotation of like some kind of like sexual stuff happening, which wouldn't be at all surprising based on the Old Testament and the ancient Near East, that they're sort of cultic sexual practices associated with idol worship, and that sense of they wanted a party, right? But now they don't know how to live, right? The law has been taken from them in some real sense, right? So not just God's presence, which I think is notable, but also God's instructions for, like, Monday through Thursday, right? Like, based on their disobedience and rebellion. So there's this sense of, like, right, act like Egypt, get judged like Egypt. I feel like that is a strong theme we've got going on in Exodus, and we return to the, like, Moses, right, crushing up the tablets, making them drink the water, which seems to me at the very least a reference back to plagues, in which God is making bitter water sweet for his people, right? That and then that we get at the end of 35 this sort of at the end of 32 in verse 35 this very much this sort of footnote of, and the Lord sent a plague on the people. Now the Levites standing up to participate in the judgment is interesting in light of the Levites were in charge of the cultic practices, by which I mean, like, sacrificial system of Israel. And that had just been outlined, right? So they are the ones making the sacrifices. They will be the ones when they get to the promised land, right? The Levites are the one tribe without land. They get spread out among the people. They are the pastors of the people. And so it's fitting, I think, that when Moses says, who's going to defend the ways of God, and specifically, like, the worship, the appropriate worship of God, the Levites step up. And I think, although we can understandably get a bit distracted by the violence, I think we're meant to, and the original readers were meant to read that as actually encouraging. Like, there are still people in Israel. There is a class of people, and they're actually the class of people who are charged with the care of the temple or the tabernacle at this point, who are willing to act on behalf of God, which I think is, Tyler might go to the mat with me on this one, but I think would be hard to really argue that this isn't done in Yahweh's name in some significant way. All right, any question? I want to pause there and hear thoughts, questions, before we scoot on over to like, what now?
Yeah, I was just thinking about how they made the calf,
Yeah.
with the gold earrings, but those are like the same jewelry that they got from Egypt, like that God had gifted to them. So for them to waste it on that, then it gets ground up and they have to drink it, and then a plague comes on them. It's like a lot of Egypt themes in this.
And what's interesting, Bernadette, about that too is, I mean, we get in the instructions, and Don will probably talk about that, starting even in chapter 25 of Exodus. So this is the very beginning, right, of that many chapters. The Lord said to Moses, speak to the people of Israel that they take from me a contribution. From every man whose heart moves him, you shall receive the contribution from me. And this is the contribution that you shall receive from them: gold, silver, and bronze, blue and purple and scarlet yarns, and fine twined linen, goat's hair, right? He goes on. But it's like these are also the materials meant to build the tabernacle, right? It's like and then further on we get this like enlistment of the people of God in their gifts. So it's like, if you're great at sewing, if you're great at wood, like, bring your talents to the construction project that is the construction of this place of worship, where we're going to be constantly reminded that God dwells with his people. So yeah, no, Bernadette, I think that's so helpful to notice. One more thread. Anybody else? Questions, comments? All right. So we end up with a problem, right? The covenant's been broken. Like, what does Israel do now? You can sort of imagine this sort of, I mean, they've just, it's like a devastating course of events that have just gone down. And we're left with this plague and this sense of like, okay, what happens? And what happens next? And even to sort of further underscore the point of so much of the disaster here is the loss of the true worship of God, which like is a very strange. I want to do a little bit of application here because I think this is just good for us to remember, especially if we were like have a sort of we imagine like our kicking, screaming, teenage selves going to church or whatever your story is, or maybe now, or maybe in the future, hopefully not. But I mean, this sense of like, is that what we're talking about? That Israel just was like bad at church, right? And I think that's a fair question. But what we're talking about is so much bigger. When we talk about worship, we think like an hour, maybe an hour and a half if you're really holy or come from a particular tradition on a Sunday. And we sort of categorize that as worship. But of course, for Israel, this is and for any ancient Near Eastern culture, this is central to the community. It involves every single thing they do. It involves their food preparation, it involves their daily activity with one another. And here, God is creating a theocracy. So the law is about how to govern themselves as a society, as the people of God, right? As those who have been chosen and set apart, right? Distinguished by Him. And so this sense that Israel sort of loses, has sort of shelved the opportunity to have a good church service, is not what we're talking about here. What we're talking about here is their identity as the people of God. And because they understood themselves, even in their rebellion, to have been rescued by God, right? There's this question of like, now we're out here in the wilderness, like what in the world are we going to do? And we've lost our sort of charter documents here. And so you can sort of feel the bereftness, I think, of Israel here, and Moses kind of going up. And I don't know about you guys, but in the middle of Exodus 33, and we don't have time to read through this, but in the sort of back and forth of Moses negotiating with God, we actually get this weird story about Moses, who has this like tent of meeting, which is not the tabernacle. So the instructions for the tabernacle have been given, but it hasn't been built yet. That comes at the end of Exodus. But the tent of meeting is where Moses is connecting with God. And so it says, now Moses used to take, in verse 7 of 33, used to take the tent and pitch it outside the camp, far off from the camp, and he called it the tent of meeting. And everyone who sought the Lord would go out to the tent of meeting, which was outside the camp. Whenever Moses went out to the tent, all the people would rise up and each would stand at his tent door and watch Moses until he had gone into the tent. When Moses entered the tent, the pillar of cloud would descend and stand at the entrance of the tent, and the Lord would speak with Moses. And when all the people saw the pillar of cloud standing at the entrance of the tent, all the people would rise up and worship, each at his tent door. Thus the Lord used to speak to Moses face to face, as a man speaks to his friend. I love that verse. I'm sure Caleb's going to talk about that. When Moses turned again into the camp, his assistant Joshua, the son of Nun, a young man, would not depart from the tent. A little bit of foreshadowing there about Joshua. But this sense of like the entirety of Israel sort of watching Moses go meet with God and them sort of standing there, right? And it creates this narrative tension of like, what's going to happen? Like Moses is still interacting with God. And of course, this is like not confined to this moment of rebellion, but it does seem to kind of create some narrative space where we're meant to sort of ask like, what next? We're watching Moses worship. But what is going to be kind of the long-term future for the people of Israel in their identity as the people of God and worship of God. So we get this after the negotiation, which I'm skipping over and leaving till next week. We come to Exodus 34, and this is the good stuff right here. So sounds a little bit like Exodus 24. The Lord said to Moses, cut for yourself 2 tablets of stone like the first. And it begins to sound so much like Exodus 24. And I will write on the tablets the words that were on the first tablets, which you broke. Be ready by the morning and come up in the morning to Mount Sinai and present yourself there to me on top of the mountain. No one shall come up with you. Same instructions. Let no one be seen throughout all the mountain. Let no flocks or herds graze opposite the mountain. So Moses cuts those 2 tablets of stone like the first. Again, like this stressing of like the tablets. You know, after the slow-mo breaking, it's like, this is like the recrafting of relationship between God and Israel. And he rose early in the morning and went up on Mount Sinai as the Lord had commanded him, and took in his hand 2 tablets of stone. Are we getting this? It's like how many times do we get that? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Like in the first 4 verses, we've got like 5 mentions. We're meant to have our eyes on these tablets. The Lord descended in the cloud and stood with him, Moses, there. And then the Lord does this really weird thing that becomes, I mean, this is a very critical moment in the history of Israel. God essentially introduces himself at a next level. So it's like, if you know someone and you sort of like, you know, like a month into school, you know, and you're like, I know my roommate, like freshman year, I know my roommate pretty well. This doesn't work for the freshmen this past year, but most years, I know my roommate pretty well. And then you're like in another setting with them, or they're, you know, people are sharing fun facts or something. And you get this piece of them that you feel like it's not different, but it's more. And it unlocks, maybe you go home and meet their family, or maybe they share something about their past or what they want to be. And it feels like it just unlocks, like, oh my goodness, now like I really get you. Like, this is good, you know? This is the moment between Moses and Yahweh, right? Yahweh's like, I am going to not only we're not only like back in relationship, but I'm going to tell you a little bit more about myself. And what I'm going to tell you is actually going to make sense of why in the world I would do this and not just scrap this entire project. And he says, verse 6, the Lord passed before him and proclaimed, the Lord, or Yahweh, a God. And he's like, Moses, here's who I am, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for thousands, or to the 1,000th generation, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, but who will by no means clear the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children and the children's children to the 3rd and 4th generation. And then Moses has this incredibly appropriate response. quickly bowed his head toward the earth and worshiped. And then he makes this request of the Lord. He's like, now that I know this about you, can you just remind me, can you tell me one more time that you're going to be with us? They'll just send an angel. Like, are you going to come? And then in verse 10, and he said, behold, I am making a covenant. Before all your people, I will do marvels such as have not been created, which is pay attention to that word, in all the earth or in any nation. So a new thing that involves creating. And all the people among whom you are, that's such an awkward phrasing, all the people among whom you are shall see the work of the Lord, for it is an awesome thing that I will do with you. And then I'm going to skip ahead to verse 27. And the Lord said to Moses, write these words, for in accordance with these words, I have made a covenant with you and with Israel. So he was there with the Lord 40 days and 40 nights. He neither ate bread nor drank water. And he wrote on the tablets the words of the covenant, the 10 commandments, or the 10 words. Covenant renewal plus. This is just we could do so much here. One thing I want to point out, this is your Hebrew word for the day, for the year. There's a word, the word is hesed. It's transliterated Hesed. And it's normally translated, it's translated a bunch of ways into English, but most often steadfast love is the way it shows up in scripture. So you might be like, oh yeah, I read a psalm recently. It's all over the place. And it is the best way that the biblical writers seem to know to talk about God's loyal love. The love that, this is like the prodigal son kind of love, the love that comes for his people, the love that is pursuing and is pretty like relentless. There's this sense of the love that God has is the kind of love that sinks its teeth in you and won't let you go. And so what Moses is being exposed to is the tenacity of God and his fierce love for his people. And we're meant to look at this and go, this is the kind of God that is offering himself despite the iniquity, despite the sin of his people. He is coming back into ultimately incarnational, but like dwelling with kind of relationship. And so he's doing that with what purpose? Well, I think in verse 10, we're getting a glimpse of what God is doing. And it's what he's been doing with Israel from the beginning. It's what he was doing with Abraham, which is he's starting a new creation project with his people. Right? He's saying, I'm not just like, it's not just because you're my favorite, he's basically like, you guys are like pretty unimpressive all by yourself, but because I have put my name on you and I'm going with you, there's this possibility and option for actually like a new creation. And what we'll see, and I'm sure Don will talk about this, is actually the tabernacle, spoiler alert, is meant to look like Eden. So there's tons of parallels in the worship space of Israel that is meant to remind them that God is doing a new thing, he's starting over in some real way with them. And so when he recovenants with them, I think like how much hope and just sort of wonder can we take in that this is the God who continually comes for his people with that kind of loyal love, which of course is the exact same motivator for the new covenant in Jesus. So God kind of coming after with his promises, really in some ways, it doesn't start here, but it is certainly highlighted here in a way that becomes really central to the story of God's people. So I think we have a few minutes left. Yes, I mean, it is just everywhere. Yes, Sarah. I mean, it's so fun, and you'll even see this formula of the name of God show up in other places in the New Testament or in the Old Testament. Sorry. But yeah. So, any questions before I want to give a few minutes at least here? I don't know what our procedure is. Barsa, Sarah, anyone? Are we just like having people ask their questions straight up?
Yes, I think so. We didn't put the Q&A doc, so feel free to just speak.
My favorite.
You guys could also put it in the chat if you're more comfortable with that.
You guys are quiet today.
Ask a question.
Douglas, I love that you raised your hand.
Indeed. Showing
Yeah.
up for class. But anyways, so we're thinking about, rightly worshiping.
Yeah.
And I guess this is sort of bringing in other pieces of the Old Testament. But, we have places where the patriarchs will set up altars. And isn't it in, either First or Second Samuel where David has like his ephod or something, and he inquires of the Lord. So, I mean, I don't have a question like that is very concrete, but just thinking about like what's the line between like acceptable worship not in the temple / in the tabernacle and like outside of it. Yeah.
Oh man. Wow, Douglas, that you just really punched me in the face with that question. Yeah, it certainly is the exception to the rule that you would be going outside of what gets outlined in places like Exodus, and then kind of begin to see that fleshed out when the temple arrives with Solomon. So in general, things like the Levites, right, become, I mean, there are rules about who can sacrifice and who, and when David in particular goes outside of those rules, I think we're meant to understand that as more of like a prophetic movement than one that, because anytime anyone's sort of taking license, they end up in trouble. But then we, of course, see Jesus, right, moving outside of those parameters and saying, like, hey, P.S., like, man, for the Sabbath, right? And beginning to just really say, like, what was the point of all of this? And that really becomes the marker of the faithful, is that they understand kind of where everything is headed. And so I think, that we see that a bit in the Old Testament. And we see it in particular in both the Old and the New Testament in those who are controlled by the Spirit of God. So, yeah, I don't know if that, but that's a great question. Man, I'll be thinking more about that for sure. What else?
Teal, is it possible that like, I guess as we talk about proper worship, like that God's rage isn't just produced by the fact that Israel isn't worshiping in a temple or something like that, but my mind was like blown by the fact that Aaron says like tomorrow shall be a feast to Yahweh. Like I thought he was like I just always figured they made up a new god. But the question I'm asking is like, isn't it possible that the rage that God feels is that he's being expressed, his character somehow is being expressed through this golden calf, and he sort of explicitly forbids his nature, character, whatever, to be expressed through the according to the commandment, right? Like the likeness of any created thing, like on the earth and all that stuff.
Yes, 100%. Yeah, no, I think, I mean, when we talk about, like, I mean, I think about there's so much here, right, with idolatry, but I think about the Isaiah passage of, goes through that whole litany of like, you get the metal and then you put it in the fire and you craft it and then you bow down and worship it. And Isaiah says, isn't there a moment when you look at the thing in your hand and you say, is not this thing in my hand a lie? Right. And I, that's certainly undergirding the like prohibition of creating an image, right? Which is that then you're looking at something that is not an accurate representation of Yahweh. I think it's really interesting that not only does Yahweh in short order show part of himself to Moses, but he also actually gives him language that is accurate to represent himself, which I think, sort of undergirds the fact that we actually are handed a faith that expresses itself considerably in language over image, and we're meant to sort of understand one another as those who are in the image of God, that sort of reserved space of image connected to God. But no, 100%.
Yeah, it's super interesting that, I mean, it's not necessarily a explicit juxtaposition, but like God is really angry at Israel for representing him through a calf, but Moses, like that, the fudging of the sort of like line between God and Moses in verses 27 and 28, right? Like Moses says, these are the words of the Lord, and then it says, and the people did according to the word of Moses. Like there's a sort, maybe a deliberate kind of fudging there, because Moses is kind of like speaking in this almost like heightened representation of the image of God, or like God means to be represented by Moses, is what I'm trying to communicate here.
Yeah, there's this whole thing on like federal headship. Are you going to talk about this, Caleb? Which Caleb will talk about next week. But basically, who gets to represent groups of people, or So I think that's certainly at play here, for sure.
Thanks.
Catherine, did you have a question?
Oh yeah. Okay, I'll make it quick. It's like a very specific question, but chapter 33, verse 11. So it says, thus the Lord used to speak to Moses face to face.
Yeah.
And then 20 says, you cannot see my face, for no man shall see and live. And I was just wondering, like, is one of them metaphorical or?
Yeah, I think the face to face is metaphorical. There's this like, there's this, just a reference to like the kind of access, like relational access, that Moses was given. But I love that passage. Oh,
wait, where is that one?
Verse 11 of 33, chapter 33.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Well, guys, thank you so much for hanging and for talking, so that I wasn't just sitting here listening to crickets. I'd love to pray, and then unless there are more announcements. Yeah, God, we want to be the kind of people who know you as a friend, and know you face to face, and Lord, and that's just actually an option in light of Jesus and the Holy Spirit indwelling us. Yeah, so Lord, thank you for that you're a covenant making, covenant keeping God, that even when we are covenant breakers, when we are disobedient and rebellious, you are a God who goes out of your way to show loyal love, to pursue, to bless to the 1000th generation, but also to show justice, to not allow things to be unaccounted for. And so, God, we praise you for what we know to be true of you. And Lord, we know in part, but one day we'll know fully and we will see you face to face. So we look to that day. Lord, help us to anticipate it and long for it and look forward to it. Help us to live lives worthy of that moment. Lord, we love you. We pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen.